English people at present time do speak thus and so, for the following reasons. Knowing this fact, we shall undoubtedly choose to speak so, in order to easily and precisely understand what others are saying, or to avoid any appearance of eccentricities or ignorance. But grammar goes no further than that, to only report and explain the usage of language, leaving us to choose for ourselves whether we should follow them or not. This ties into our reader, Umberto Eco, born January 5th, 1932, in Alessandria region of the Piedmont in northern Italy. And just to give a little background on who he is, he was born to Giulio and Giovanna Eco. And Giulio's father was Attilio, who was a foundling and was founded by the mayor of this Piedmont city, and literally found on the doorstep of the city hall. And he named the young boy Eco, which means a gift from heaven. So it's an acronym in Italian, Excelsius Oplamos. So anyways, his father was an accountant and then an officer in the Italian army in foreign service. And what Umberto had is he had a Salesian education by St. Francis de Sales, which is an education in the theory and theology of the Roman Church and the practices of the language of the Roman Church. So in his youth, he was very familiar with the language, very familiar with Latin. He spoke by the time he was 10. He was fluent in all of the Romantic languages. And his education was at the University of Turin. 1950s when he entered, and he began to question church and God. And then by 1953, he absolutely stopped believing in God, and he left the Roman Church. And in 1954, when he graduated with his degree in philosophy, which is essentially on medieval philosophy and literature, and his thesis was on Thomas Aquinas, he wrote a letter to the Pope asking to be relieved of his Roman Catholic duties. And the Pope responded to him because of how well written it was. In his own pen, not by an archbishop or a bishop. So he began his study in mass media and culture in 1954. And he started to publish in 7 weeklies. And he was working as the cultural editor for the state broadcasting system in Italy. And in 1954, he began his first book. And in 1954, he began lecturing at the University of Turin. And by the end of 1954, he had his first book published, which is basically the problems of Thomas Aquinas. That's translated into English. And by the end of 1956, He had 7 weeklies and 60 magazine articles weekly. 1957, he began to write his second book, and it was published, and it's the development of medieval aesthetics. And he leaves the broadcast media. He serves in the Italian army for about 18 months, and he becomes senior nonfiction editor at the largest publishing house in Italy, in Milan, called Bampini, which is now currently owned by the former president of Italy. What he then did in 1959 is he pioneered the process of reader's response. And of course he develops his apartment in Milan. Just a little side note about his apartment in Milan. His library is a little over 30,000 volumes. And he's not just finished with pioneering reader's response, he pioneers the open text concept. And in 1961, he writes his first short essay, called The Phenomenology of Michael Brezano, which is basically, this guy had a critical thought on his process of writing, and this is his response back to him. This is that open response. And in 1962, he marries German art historian Renata Rage, and begins to write and publish The Absent Structure. This is when he then formulates a whole new mass in semiotics. The formalization of language, the origin of words, the relationship of syntax, and the formalization of sentences and pragmatics, and why do we write, read, and understand the way we do as human beings. And this brought him into a whole new world, an intellectual, the intellectual glitterati of Italy. And he founds a group called Gruppo 63. And this is a group of avant-garde artists, musicians, writers, and they talk about, and they write about, and they produce music in reference to not only the situations, the academic situations of the language, but also what is going on worldwide, culturally. How is culture affected by media? And how does media affect culture? Is there a mass migration to it? You know, and remember, this is in the early 1960s, when television was very new. And of course, he writes and publishes his mini diary in 1963. In 1964, he leaves the University of Turin, and he finds and develops the most important approach to semiotics, called the interpretive semiotics. Interpretive, before it wasn't interpretive. It was a solid science where there couldn't be suggestions or being subjected to outside influences. With mass media, as we've all experienced, we are subjected to a massive amount of not only information, but a massive amount of white noise. So he co-founds a magazine called Verses in Semiotics, and writes and publishes basically his appeal to the intelligent people of the world. That's a translation into English. Oh, and his son is born in 1964. In 1965, he builds his home in Urbano, and his daughter is born. Another little interesting thing, he has his apartment in Milan with 30,000 volumes, and his home in Urbano has 20,000 volumes. So he has quite the library. Every year from 1967 to 1975, he wrote a book, either on the interpretation of semiotics or a great novel, an expansive novels. These are tomes. And in 1975, he leaves Bampini Press, and he writes The Theory of Semiotics, which is probably the most recognized book of that particular science. And that particular book is used in every course in that field. So in 79, he takes a break in 76 and 78 to deal with his family and to teach at the local university. And what he wants is a participation of the reader. How do you get a participation of the reader? And he had no idea how to do this. So he wrote and published a book called The Role of the Reader. Because with every book that's written, somebody reads it. And what does the reader do? What is the main objective of the reader? To take that book and to tell somebody else about it. It's a word of mouth. So anyways, in the 80s, he becomes incredibly famous for this particular science, and he begins his U.S. tour in 1980. And his very first tour as a visiting lecturer, and he attended all of the Ivies and lectured at every single one on these issues. Some of these Ivies, Columbia, Harvard, and the University of IU at Bloomington and Rutgers, hired him on as a visiting professor. And this is still continuing today. Now, by the 1990s, not only is he teaching at Columbia, Harvard, University of Indiana, and Rutgers, but now he has full-time position at the University of Bologna, the University of Timbuktu, University of Belgrade, and the University of the Republic of San Marino. And by 2000, he's given, and by the way, the only Italian given the fellowship at the Kellogg College at University of Oxford in England. This man is not just a founder of a science, but he's a writer, a philosopher, a critic, a novelist, an essayist, and the language technician of the world. And he's still living with us today. I lost my train of thought. His new book that was just published this year is on the concept of media, mass media, social media, and the concept of networking. And how does that affect how does that affect the language? How does that affect the reader? And how does that affect the writer? That's what I'm going to end with. I'd like to thank the Blueberry Patch for hosting us, Martha Muzzy, and of course Kurt Thompson. That's it.